Hey guys, Script here with another video, and I felt like this was a really, really important video to put out right now, especially right now with what's going on with the Acolyte. Some of the information that's come out, there's a supposed plot leak. I did a video about that yesterday. Feel free to check that out. I'll put it in the description. And what's happening through that plot leak is that people are suggesting that the Jedi were kidnapping kids. And I have people commenting on the video saying, yeah, all the Jedi were morally bankrupt pieces of crap, and yeah, they did take kids. There's this whole movement, and it's not because Disney's directly saying it, but they're kind of implying it a lot, that the Jedi were like awful. Like, part of the reason they fell in the prequels was because they were just awful and immoral and morally bankrupt, and that's the reason. And the leak is suggesting they're incorporating that into the Acolyte, where they're actually like kidnapping kids. So I'm going to go over this. This is George Lucas from the archives. So this is interviews that are happening on the spot while they're filming the prequels and where George is coming from, or just after them. Now, just really quick, my personal thoughts always were that the Jedi didn't kidnap kids. I always thought of it as like it was like going to boarding school. Now, in George's Star Wars, I don't know 100% if they were just never allowed to see their parents again. You could argue it's suggested in the fact that they didn't let Anakin go back and see his mom prior to when he finally did and ended up seeing her dying or whatever. But does that necessarily mean they were never allowed to? Right? And then you have the Disney Luke making Grogu choose, essentially saying you're never allowed to see your dad. Even with the whole Anakin thing, my whole take was that if Anakin had decided to go and see his mom or get her on a ship and fly her out, he could have. The reason he couldn't is she was still Watto's. I never got the impression he wasn't allowed to go to Tatooine ever again and ever see her again. It's just she couldn't leave planet. He had to do his Jedi training in Attack of the Clones, and she was a slave. She was still property of Watto. Yes, of course you could make the argument, why didn't the Jedis free the slaves? That is kind of weird. Maybe it's just they don't do that type of thing. It's a political thing on that planet. I don't know exactly. Having said all that, this idea that the Jedi were just this morally awful and they deserved it. They deserved what Palpatine did to them. That's what a lot of these young people and just people are actually suggesting. And they're trying to say that the Acolyte represents what was really going on with the Jedi. They were just morally bankrupt, corrupt pieces of crap that stole kids and were bad, and they deserved what they got from Palpatine. So let's hear from George Lucas himself, who made the prequels. And again, the Acolyte takes place decades before the prequels. That doesn't make any sense if they're completely different. So this is from the archives, which are from 1999, 2005. So that's literally during the production of the prequels, right? Or at least just after The Phantom Menace and during the production of Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. So here's what George Lucas says about the prequel Jedi, the supposed kidnappers from the Acolyte. They are the most moral of anybody in the galaxy. Boy, that really stares in the face of this idea that the reason that they were manipulated by Palpatine is because they were this morally bankrupt pieces of crap. That's weird. Huh. That contradicts exactly what the Acolyte leak says and exactly what all these people on Twitter and YouTube are telling me. Because they just can't imagine that Palpatine's just this master manipulator. They can't be. The Jedi are evil. Bah! Where do people get this stuff? It's like, do you even watch Star Wars? So, George Lucas says, no, they're not like cops who catch murderers. They're warrior monks who keep peace in the universe without resorting to violence. Which might be, one of the reasons they didn't go and free all the slaves, because they would have had to resort to violence. The Trade Federation is in dispute with Naboo, so the Jedi are ambassadors who talk both sides, that does happen in the movie, and convince them to resolve their differences and not go to war. And I mean, you got that vibe. Like, Qui-Gon totally had the peaceful monk vibe. Like, he probably more than any Jedi, period, in any of the 6 films. And so, yeah, he negotiated with the Gungans, he negotiated with the Nubians, he negotiated with the Trade Federation, at least tried to. But of course, they were corrupted by Palpatine or Sidious and attempted to assassinate them. And even then, they didn't kill them. They killed the battle droids, if you remember. If they do have to use violence, they will. But they are diplomats at the highest level. They've got the power to send the whole force of the Republic, which is 100,000 systems. So if you don't behave, they can bring you up in front of the Senate. They'll cut you off at the knees politically. In other words, when we saw the Jedi as part of the military force in Attack of the Clones, that was because they essentially had the power over the military force. So it's different. I know everybody wants to think it's exactly like the United States or something. It's not like that. So you had the warrior monks were entrusted with having power over the military to keep things from getting out of control. And the less control they got of the military, if you watch Sidious and Palpatine continue to gain influence and sway on both sides with Dooku and everything else, they started to lose control. That was one of the big things that Palpatine did that nobody wants to give him credit for because it's just because the Jedi are evil. Nah. But as he says here, instead of resorting to violence, because they have power politically in that sense, they'll cut you off at the knees politically. So they'll go to the Senate and they'll say, well, these people are not peaceful. They're causing problems. So what do we do? And through legislation, instead of violence, things are dealt with, which makes perfect sense. If you're going to have 1,000 years or 1,000 generations, whatever it is, like Obi-Wan said, of peace, a relative peace, they're going to have to do that without resorting to violence. And so what George is saying here makes absolutely perfect sense. And this, much like Qui-Gon dying and how that impacted Anakin, I think really informs those movies and what really was going on with the Jedi involved in the military and everything else that was going on. That was their last resort. And if you watch the movies, they always pleaded with Palpatine when he was Chancellor to not push violence. They said repeatedly there must be another way. And eventually he won the Senate over them. You get it? Do you see how this is informing the prequels? So he was the Chancellor and he's talking to all the senators and convincing them that they need to continue to use violence while the Jedi are saying, whoa, wait a minute, we need to think about this. And if you watch all those scenes, it's very clear. And there's scenes where the Jedi just lose it. They lose control. He ends up manipulating the Senate into his favor, and the Jedi lose the power of the political end, which can cut people off at the knees, so that they don't have to resort to violence. Do you see what this all is? The Jedi are not these morally bankrupt people. This is good storytelling, actually. Although I would argue the execution in the prequels could have been done a little better. Hearing him say this, it actually does make a lot of sense. They're like police officers. As the situation develops in the Clone Wars, they are recruiting it into the army, and they become generals. Now, young people are going to have a problem with that because young people have been taught that all police officers are violent pieces of garbage. And that's their whole thing. What they don't understand is some of them are, but when you go to the police academy and you learn you are actually supposed to de-escalate is the absolute first choice. It's all about de-escalation in all forms of policing. Other than totalitarian, fascist or communist countries where they just killed you. But de-escalation is what American and Western police are taught. That doesn't mean they all follow that. There's a lot of idiots, but that is what they are taught. They're recruited into the army and they become generals. They're not generals. They don't kill people. They don't fight. They're supposed to be ambassadors. There are a lot of Jedi that think that the Jedi sold out, that they should never have been in the military. And again, a lot of that had to do with Palpatine, again, manipulating the situation, making them think they needed to be part of that. So Duncan says, do you think that they never should have been in the military? George says it's a tough call. See, so it's not as cut and dry. It's one of the conundrums of which there's a bunch of in my movies. He's admitting there's some conundrums. You have to think it through. Are they going to stick with their moral rules and all be killed, which makes it irrelevant, or do they help save the Republic? In other words, Order 66 was Order 66, but if the Jedi didn't get involved, they probably would have just been killed, because then they would have just been routed by Palpatine and his... Well, he was in control of both sides of the war, right? They have good intentions, but they have been manipulated, which was their downfall. No, their downfall is they're immoral, and they deserve it. They're stupid. This is what makes Palpatine such an awesome villain, man. Palpatine is the man. As much as I loved him in the OT, the one thing I always love about the prequels, there's a bunch of stuff I love, there's a bunch of stuff I don't like, but one thing I love about the prequels is showing how sick and master manipulator and awesome Palpatine is as a villain. You talk about playing the long game, right? Because when I was a kid growing up in the 80s, Saturday morning cartoons, it was always the loudmouth schnook villain that announced his plan, right? He'd, Dr. Evil style, right? He'd get Austin Powers and then tell Austin Powers his entire plan of what he was going to do because he thinks that Austin Powers is never going to escape, right? Which is making fun of those 80s cartoons and other movies and stuff as well. And then his son's like, bro, why don't I just shoot him in the head right now? Let's just shoot him. And then he's like, no, put him in the room where there's no guards, and we'll just hope that the sharks with laser beams get him, right? It's making fun of that. What made Palpatine such a cool villain, and especially with when it came out in the 90s, and it was kind of opposite of all that stuff we got through the 80s and mid-90s where the villains would announce themselves, is he played the long game. So if people, guys, stop saying the Jedi were immoral, say that Palpatine was just a master Sith, and he was a master manipulator. That's what we need to be talking about, not how the Jedi's downfall was just because the Jedi. Anyways, they have been manipulated. What was their downfall? There was never a war between the Jedi and Sith Lords. Never a war between Jedi and Sith Lords. Okay, now we're getting what appears in the Acolyte pretty clearly to be Sith Jedi physical confrontation. And I know people are going to say, well, it might be a dark Jedi. I said in my last video, I act like a Sith, I talk like a Sith, I do everything like a Sith, but I have labeled myself a dark Jedi. No, you're just a Sith. Give me a break. Actions speak louder than words. The Sith Lords were in control for a long time, and what happens when you have a world full of Sith Lords? They start killing each other to see who's going to be the top Sith Lord. They don't vote, they just kill. It's a medieval feudal system, which is, of course, the opposite of the diplomacy of the Jedi, right? Then the Republic came to power, and the Jedi brought peace into the galaxy by being ambassadors and troubleshooters. So this is now, after that all happened, then you get 1,000 years of peace with the Jedi who brought peace. No, they were morally bankrupt idiots. Into the galaxy by being ambassadors and troubleshooters. So they're doing everything they can to avoid violence. They're not kidnapping kids. That's a violent act. Acolyte, if that's what you do. And all you dummies that think that makes sense. So when the Senate decides to do something, or the Jedi Council discovers something that's amiss, the Jedi fix it. The Jedi don't like to fight people. Can you imagine George Lucas's Jedi don't like to fight people? They're monk warriors, but they're kidnapping kids. How absolutely ridiculous that is. If they go that route in the Acolyte, this is literally the biggest bastardization of what Star Wars was meant to be ever. This is even worse than Rey being a Mary Sue. This is a total destruction of the Jedi, which is the focal point of Star Wars. They're monks first, and they try to convince people to get along. I.e., Qui-Gon talks about Anakin with his mother, and talks to her and tells her that this is the best thing for him, and gets him out of slavery, right? Helps get him out of slavery, and she agrees. Not, I'm kidnapping you. They're monks first. They work it out diplomatically. They don't kidnap people. The Acolyte is a disgrace if that's what they did. And if you don't comply, your hand comes off. I think in that context, he's talking about, like what would be equivalent to like empirical or people on systems, organized crime, things of that nature. They use their power to keep the governments of all the planets in line so that they don't do terrible things. In other words, their diplomatic power and all that type of stuff. And also, I think when he means hands come off, if you dovetail that with what he said earlier, he's basically saying they could cut you off at the knees. In other words, you lose all your diplomatic abilities, and it can affect you very negatively. And they have the moral authority to do that. And George says, yeah, they are the most moral of anybody in the galaxy. They're monks. The Sith practice the dark side and are way off of balance. Remember all my videos in the past, guys, talking about balance is not equal dark and equal light. It's not, oh, there's 2 Siths, there's 2 Jedi, it's balanced. Yeah. No. The Sith practice the dark side and are way off of balance. I think this might be the most important video I've ever done, you guys. Please share this video, because this is laying it down to the core. And this speaks to all the garbage that Disney's been putting out, all the crap that Filoni puts out, the twisting of all of these concepts that are very basic and simple, okay? But Disney has really been slowly shatting on them all. The Jedi aren't as much out of balance because they're the light side of the Force. Oh my gosh. Well, would you look at that? Almost as if balance in the Force is light side. I can't believe these idiots. And by the way, Filoni believes it's equal light and equal dark. He told that to Freddie Prinze Jr. when they were doing Rebels. So he ain't no George Lucas protege. He's taking Star Wars and he's doing whatever the heck he pleases with it, is what it is. They still have the bad side of the Force in them, but they keep it in check. In other words, dark Jedi don't exist. It's always there So because Dark Jedi are not keeping it in check. It's always there, so it can always erupt if you let your guard down, which is exactly what Yoda tells Luke in The Empire Strikes Back. The Emperor snookered the Jedi with Order 66. The nascent rebellion and the Jedi didn't move fast enough. That's their mistake. Their mistake is not being immoral. Their mistake is being manipulated by Palpatine, and they didn't move fast enough. And it was too late. So all you fake fans, shills, and anybody else, and then all you people that are open to the fact that maybe you are incorrect and you just really like Star Wars, here you go. This is the truth. This is what it really is. The Jedi won't lead droids. Their whole basis is connecting with the Force. They just say, that's not the way we operate. We don't function with non-life. So if there is to be a Republic army, it would have to be an army of humans, which essentially it was with the clones, right? That's the side they fought on. And this is George Lucas's foreword for Shadowpoint, the book Shadowpoint. For 1,000 years, the Old Republic prospered and grew under the wise rule of the Senate and the protection of the venerable Jedi Knights. Get it? Venerable. If you don't know what that means, look it up. As dedicated as the Separatists were in their resolve to create a new order to replace the failing Republic, the Jedi were equally determined to preserve the Republic and defeat the Sith, who they understood all too well were the masterminds of the Separatist movement. They still believed in the Republic, still deemed it a Republic worth saving. Their faith, which gave them superhuman strength in the face of mind-boggling power of the enemy, had yet to be shaken. Okay, there you go. So they tried and they failed. They were too late. But these are not immoral guys. And one last thing to emphasize this, guys, is that the difference between the Jedi and Sith is that the Jedi want to use diplomacy and not resort to violence and try and get people to have peace through those means. Whereas the Sith, and this is from George Lucas's own mouth, want to dominate the galaxy to control everything. So that's one last thing I want to mention. A lot of these noobs or certain guys, they want to think that the Jedi just were in control of everything. They were not. And if you watch those movies, it's very clear. They're constantly going to different places and trying to negotiate with guys and find out what's actually going on. They're not just trying to dominate everybody. That's the difference between the Jedi and Sith. The Jedi are absolutely 100% morally superior. There is absolutely no question about it. So this graying, this blurring of the lines that it appears the Acolyte is going to do is not part of Star Wars, and certainly in that part of the timeline is not part of Star Wars. If you wanted to do something after Return of the Jedi that showed Jedi just totally just being corrupted and all turning into Sith who wanted to control the galaxy and being totally immoral and kidnapping kids, you know what? For all intents and purposes, I wouldn't probably like that, but at least you could do that without breaking lore and destroying the mythos and everything else. But you can't do that 100 years or whatever it is before The Phantom Menace. It doesn't make any sense. Again, I say it. We don't know for sure if that leak is right, but if it is, this is literally the worst thing they've ever done. This is worse than Rey. This is worse than Finn yelling. This is worse than Rose saving Finn. This is an attack at the heart of what Star Wars is, which is the Jedi and the focus on them bringing peace and hope and prosperity to the galaxy. It's called A New Hope for a reason. If they are doing this, this is literally the absolute worst thing they've ever done. And they have done a lot of absolutely terrible things, most of which are just laughable. This is actually like really bad. This is morally reprehensible if this is the road that the Acolyte is going to go. So anyways, I hope I'm wrong, or I hope the leak is wrong, I should say. There gives you some insight into all these topics that I've been talking about for weeks on end. This kind of culminates it all together. Like I said, if you know people that like Star Wars, please send them this video. Not because I'm great or I know what I'm talking about, but because we see all of these issues that are constantly debated on Twitter from George Lucas's own mouth. And we get a very informed view of what the prequels meant and how everything goes together and what the Jedi really are. And we can put all of these arguments to rest if people watch this video. So I would implore you to please share this video. If you like this content, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. And check out anything else, including, like I said, my video from yesterday and all of my other videos for literally years where I've been talking about these issues. But this really, really puts it to rest. Please comment whatever you want to comment. Have yourselves a really good day.